Hi everyone, how are you doing today? It's a very grey and rainy day here in London, which is sort of appropriate because it's the start of the autumnal season, so there's going to be a lot more of this. But that also means it is almost the start of Victober, and I decided I want to participate in Victober this year for a few reasons that I'll talk about. And if you don't know what Victober is, it's basically an online read-along through the month of October, from October 1st to the 31st, where people try to read as much Victorian literature as possible. So books that are published in the Victorian era during the reign of Queen Victoria, which lasted from 1837 to 1901. So any book was published during that time. And I've always wanted to read more classic literature, so I think it's great that Victober happens, and I'm excited to join along. So there are 4 people hosting Victober this year, and they've each created a prompt to inspire people to get to read different Victorian literature. So I'm going to go through those prompts. The 4 hosts are Lucy the Reader, Katie of Books and Things, Ange from Beyond the Pages, and Kate Howe. So I'll put links to their announcement videos below so you can find out more about Victober if you don't know about it already. So the first prompt is read an underrated Victorian book published in the same year as your favorite Victorian classic. And I sort of was thinking about this, and I think a lot of people are probably going to go for this same book. I'm going to probably say that my favorite Victorian novel is Jane Eyre, which was published in 1847. And there's not a huge amount of choice of other quite well-known books published in that same year. And so I'm going to go with the same novel that Lucy the Reader picked, which is The McDermotts of Ballyconnell by Anthony Trollope. And this is actually Anthony Trollope's first novel. And I want to read this for a couple of reasons, because I've always wanted to read Anthony Trollope because my paternal grandmother, that's right, is it? Yeah, my father's mother was a huge Anthony Trollope fan, and I've never read Anthony Trollope. And so I want to start with this because whenever I read classic authors, I have that really geeky thing where I want to go back to the very beginning, read their first novel, and then read all their novels in the order that they wrote them, just to get a big overview of their career, I guess. I don't know, it's just a slightly sort of anal part of me that wants to read every book written by a classic author in the order that they actually wrote them. And this is a novel about a Catholic Irish family in the 1800s that are struggling to make a living and keep their household in an area which is predominantly Protestant. And so it sounds like an interesting story, and the novel has quite mixed reviews, but I think Anthony Trollope said he was very proud of the story and structure of it, even if he thought the execution of it wasn't as perfect as it could be. The next prompt is to read a book by a Victorian female author, and there's an added bonus if you read one that is new to you. And for this, I want to pick Mary Barton, A Tale of Manchester Life by Elizabeth Gaskell. And I know this isn't her most famous novel. I also have a copy of her novel North and South, which is probably better known and I think has sort of similar themes, but I want to read this novel for a couple of reasons as well, because this is also, Mary Barton is Elizabeth Gaskell's first novel, so again, that geeky thing of wanting to read, and I've never read Elizabeth Gaskell before, so I'm starting with her first novel as well, but also I'm really interested in reading this novel because it portrays the life of a number of normal working class people in Manchester. I think it predominantly follows 2 families, and Mary Barton is a young woman trying to find her place in the world, and she has an aunt who becomes a prostitute, and all sorts of dramatic things happen. But I want to read this particularly because there's another new novel which is just being published at the beginning of October called The Private Joys of Nina Maloney, and this novel is also set in Manchester and follows the life of a young woman in modern-day Manchester as she's trying to find her place in the world. So I think it'll be really fun and interesting to see this pairing of Manchester life from the mid-1800s to Manchester life in the current day. Prompt number 3 is to read a Victorian book under 200 pages and or over 500 pages. And for this, because I mean, one of the big prompts to get me to join in Victober was because I recently went to Haworth for the first time, the village that was the home of the Brontes, and so that really reignited my passion for reading the Brontes and wanting to read more of the Brontes. And so, of course, I had to include a Bronte in this. And when I made a video talking about my trip there, I asked suggestions of people of what Bronte novel to read next. And I was quite surprised. A lot of people responded saying The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I'm getting my Brontes mixed up. And this is a novel, actually, when I selected it, I thought it was over 500 pages, but I just looked at the end, and it's actually 492 pages. So it's just under the 500 page limit. But I think it can count anyway. And I also want to read a novel that's under 200 pages. So, you know, I think that's fine. And but this novel sounds quite interesting. So it's about a beautiful young woman who comes to inhabit this place called Wildfell Hall, and she's a widow, and there's lots of rumors and gossips surrounding her. So it sounds like a really good story, and like I said, I've heard lots of good things about it. So the novel under 200 pages is one I want to actually reread, which is Silas Marner by George Eliot. And I read this novel quite a long time ago. I went through a sort of George Eliot period where I read a lot of her books, including this one, and so I'd like to refresh my memory about it and reread this. But I also want to read Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, because this is a novel I've never read by George Eliot, and I made a video at the beginning of this year talking about classics I want to read in 2019, and this is one of them. I have this beautiful modern library edition, which has an introduction by Edmund White, who's one of my favorite authors. And it's been sitting on my shelves for ages and ages, so I think it's time I finally got around to this novel. So the novel concerns a woman who's in a sort of loveless marriage with a not very nice man, and she meets another man named Daniel Deronda, who is sort of spiritually counseling her, but Daniel Deronda discovers that he's in fact Jewish, and this comes as quite a surprise to him. And so it's about him sort of discovering his Jewish heritage, I think. So yes, I'm quite keen to read this novel. And then the final prompt is to reread a Victorian book. And like I already said, I want to reread Silas Marner, or Silas Marner. Is it Silas Marner or Silas? I think it's probably Silas Marner, isn't it? And then there are a couple final prompts to get you in the mood for reading Victorian literature. So one of the prompts is to read by candlelight, as people would have done during Victorian times. And of course they specified that you don't have to read a whole novel by candlelight. It can just be for an evening or an hour or so. So yeah, I think I probably will try this at some evening. There's going to be a couple evenings coming up when I'm going to be home alone. So I think that'll be a good time to light a whole bunch of candles and really get in the mood. That almost sounds a bit saucy, doesn't it? Anyway, the final prompt is a group read-along to read a couple plays, because they're trying to encourage people to read things other than novels, like nonfiction. And so there are a couple plays by Oscar Wilde that everybody's going to be reading along together, and that is The Importance of Being Earnest and A Woman of No Importance. And this comes at a good time, because a few months ago I read this big, huge, recent biography of Oscar Wilde by Matthew Sturgis. You can see it's really long, and I really enjoyed that, and that's prompted me to want to reread. I mean, I've read a lot of Oscar Wilde's plays or seen them performed and read a lot of his work before, so I have read The Importance of Being Earnest before, but I've never read or seen A Woman of No Importance, so I'll be glad to read that for the first time. So that is my TBR list for Victober. It's quite hefty, but I'm quite excited to join along. So let me know if you'll be joining in Victober as well, if you read any of the books that I've been talking about, and what selections you've made to read in Victober as well. So hope you're doing well, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye everyone.